actually, Peter makes it really simple for us. There's a lot of things that we start with. We want to know about who's writing and who's it being written to, and Peter makes it very clear, more so than some other letters that we have studied, of who is writing this when he starts off at the very beginning. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So the author is very clearly stated. It's never been contested. There are a lot of letters that critics of the Bible have challenged as far as the authorship and who actually wrote it. And this one is one that really has not ever been challenged, not by anyone that has any sense anyway. And so we know the Apostle Peter being the one who wrote this. The time frame fits very closely to where we are in our timeline. Seems as though Peter wrote this a little bit later. We're talking about the time. This would have been between the time of Paul's release from prison, his first imprisonment, and Paul's death, somewhere in those few years. And so for the timeline that we've been looking at in all the letters of Paul when it came to the end of his life, that now there are some that put 1 Peter as a lot later, and those are people that would challenge really even the authorship that Peter wrote it. But we have we're pretty certain that the time frame, a lot of it has to do with the people, the places, and a lot of the things that Peter mentions within the letter that help to give a little bit of a timeline for of when Peter would have made mention of these things. When we get to 2 Peter, Peter even mentions Paul's writings. Sometimes they're difficult to understand. Peter talks about them. So we know that at least 2 Peter was written after Paul had at least begun writing. And so it's little phrases like that, little things that help us to be able to find the timeline of when these things are done. Now, the recipients as well, Peter's pretty clear in verse 1 of chapter 1. He says, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia, who are chosen. So we know he's writing to Christians, and he's writing to Christians. If you look at the location of all of those places that are mentioned, they are all in what's known as Asia Minor. In other words, most of Asia Minor is what is the country of Turkey today, and so this is the churches of the people. A lot of these would have been some that the Apostle Paul would have visited and worked with, but here is the Apostle Peter. And you imagine, Paul may have come through and established many of these churches, and a lot of these churches may be established based on Christians that left after the day of Pentecost and went back home into various parts of the world. But one day, you receive a letter from the Apostle Peter, and the significance of this letter and the impact that this letter would have made would have been extraordinary. And so it definitely would have been one that they would have paid very, very close attention to. So why write this letter? What's the purpose? And when you look at the overall message that Peter gives in this entire letter, we see the purpose is really one of encouragement. And he's encouraging these Christians to make sure that they are maintaining their faith, that they are maintaining a holy lifestyle, because persecution is becoming greater. And that becomes one of the themes of this letter as well. The persecution, the struggle, the pain, the suffering that these Christians are going through. The idea of suffering is a key word that we see even throughout this letter. And so he is trying to help them understand that it's going to be worth it. So that's the purpose of why he's doing it, is to encourage these Christians. If we were to put a theme to the letter itself, if there was one statement that described the entire letter as a whole, and what Peter teaches, I believe this would be it. To live temporarily as earthly aliens so that you may live forever as heavenly citizens. That's really Peter's message. That's his central idea. That's his thesis for the entire letter, is if you will just temporarily remain faithful in a place that's a strange place. This world is not our home. And if you will live here faithfully, the reward of living eternally is going to be amazing. And so that's really what Peter is trying to impress upon these Christians at this time. And so let's look at, if we look at a broad outline of Peter, the whole book, I believe, I'm trying to remember the commentary I got the base outline out of, but it is one of the most simple but yet the best ways of outlining this letter. And the first really chapter and a half is God's grace. And the grace of God, I believe the word grace is the most commonly used word in this letter. There's no other single word of significance. You might find the word "the" in there a lot more or something like that. But of significant words, I believe grace is there as much, if not more, than any other word in this letter. Something that Paul is really wanting to, or Peter is wanting to really emphasize. So he starts off with God's grace and how God's grace is connected with our salvation. And this is something that Christians need to know because of the suffering, because of the trouble that they were going through, that it is our salvation is something that is how it's connected with God's grace. Because a lot of Christians in the first century, they may look at this and say, I don't feel like God is being very gracious. He's offered this salvation to us, but this doesn't feel very gracious to me. I just lost my family because of my faith in Jesus. I just lost my home. I just lost all of my property, my farm. I'm looked at as an outcast. I've been marked or branded in some societies because of my faith in Jesus. And so this doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of grace being involved. And so Peter is wanting to help them understand the salvation that has been promised is something that is a part of the grace of God. Then the next chapter, going into chapter 3, he's also going to deal with the grace of God and how it's connected to how we submit. How we submit to authority, how we submit to God, how we submit to each other, and how the grace of God is connected with all that. And then through the end of the book, God's grace, and he's going to emphasize through the whole rest of the letter about suffering, because this is the issue that Christians are dealing with at the time. Now there are, as we've seen in other letters from Paul and other writers, there are doctrinal issues, and there are problems within churches, and there are problems between Jews and Gentiles, and there are all kinds of issues that they're dealing with. But Peter understands this is the current issue of the day. Christians know that tonight my door may be knocked down and I will be dragged out into the streets and I will be killed because of my faith in Jesus. And because that is such a real thing happening in the lives of these Christians, Peter understood the need, of course, inspired by God. God understood the need, writing through Peter, to give this message of encouragement to these people and to help them understand, because it would be hard to comprehend, especially as early Christians in the early church, of why God would be allowing things like this to happen. I thought he was supposed to be saving us, but yet we see thousands of us around, or thousands around me are dying. And so Peter's going to try to help them make sense of all this. So let's start at the very beginning of this outline, God's grace and salvation. We'll go through this pretty quick because there's something I want to back up to, really, that's in verse 1 and kind of focus on that is the central hub of all of what Peter's saying here. Yeah, Sam? Uh-huh. Let's go to, let me look at, this is one letter that I haven't got all of my keywords circled in. Let me look at it. Right. Okay. Let me, no. I'm going to have to look at it. And see. Right. Yeah. Okay. Look at chapter 1 and verse 10, Sam. Okay. It's what did you say that was? The translation was? The New Living Translation. That is a very paraphrased translation. It's not literal at all. Yeah, because verse 10, as to this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful searches and inquiries. In verse 2, according to the foreknowledge of God and Father by sanctification, sanctifying work of the Spirit to obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with the blood, may grace and peace be yours. So it's, I believe, if I remember right, it's 10 or 11 times in this short letter that we find the word grace. And so, no, it's a great question, because depending on what translation you're looking at, and translations like that, there are several that are more of a paraphrased translations that they're not really even translations; they're paraphrase. And so, no, it's a great question. If you see something like that, it's always great to raise the question. So looking at this first part, God's grace and salvation. First thing that I'm going to keep saying Paul because we've been on Paul for a long time. The first thing that Peter across to them is the fact they have to live in hope. They have to understand that no matter what's happening in their life, what's happening around them, God's plan hasn't changed. They can have faith and have hope in who God is and what God has done and what God has promised. And so, and we're not going to have time to read through all of the text of each one of these. If you're taking notes, note just the main idea here throughout this outline, and then go back and look and see how Peter draws these thoughts out. But he's, in verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And so he's trying to draw their mind back to what is our focus? What is the main thing that I want you to understand, and that is the hope that comes through Jesus Christ, through his sacrifice and through his resurrection. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on around you that seems horrible. It is horrible. But don't forget this. God is great. God is amazing. And what they can't see at the time, we can see it today. What they can't see at the time is that their death and their suffering and that persecution was actually growing the church. It probably didn't look like that on the ground while they were going through it. As they were only seeing people who were close to them in the church that were being slaughtered, who were being imprisoned, who were being thrown into arenas to wild animals, those things that were taking place in the Roman Empire at this time, they can't see that. We can look back and see, here's what the church was before all that persecution started. Here's what the church was when it was over. And it grew and it expanded, and God knew what he was doing. And that the whole book of Revelation is about that theme of there are more that are going to have to die first. He tells them that in chapter 6 of Revelation. When the saints who have been persecuted came to him and said, how long are you going to let our enemies do this to us? And God says, take a white robe, be patient. He said, because there are more that have to die before I'm going to bring my judgment upon them. And there's no way for a human mind to understand that, especially when you're in the middle of going through it. We have the benefit to look backwards and go, God knew exactly what he was doing. Those that did die in that persecution, they didn't lose. They won. They were victorious. They are now with God. They're the ones that are seen in the throne room of God under the altar of incense that are there. They are with God. And so the persecution it wasn't a bad thing. It's physically, to a human mind, it seems horrible, but it's really not. It was victory that was happening for God's people. And if you ask those people who died in that persecution today, if we were able to ask them, was it worth it? I can guarantee you their answer. If they could show us their home now and be able to say, was it worth it? Of course it was worth it. And it's just, and Peter's trying to tap into that perspective of helping them to understand that. In verses 13 through the very beginning of chapter 2, Peter then goes into this context of living in holiness, doing what is right in the eyes of. Notice how he starts in verse 13. He says, therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope eternally on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. There's grace again. So we have preparing your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope. All of these statements that Peter is making here are statements of telling them, if you will remain holy, if you will remain true to God and true to his word, and all the rest of this going on down through the end of chapter 1 into the first couple of verses of chapter 2. Notice in chapter 2 and verse 1, put aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. Like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you will grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. And so this whole section here is Peter saying, just stay true to God. The Romans were trying to convince Christians that obviously your God has abandoned you. Your God is not a very good God. If look what he just did to your family. Look what he just allowed to happen to your family. And so does that look like a good God to you? You know what? That is no different than what we still hear today. When pain and suffering, what is the number one question we got in our own survey of our community? Every time that survey has been done in different places, the number one question is, if God is a good God, why does he allow pain and suffering? And that is such a relevant question today. And a place to go to study is going to be Peter's letter, 1 Peter, to get a perspective of what God is doing and why God is doing what we need to be doing as Christians to remain faithful in those times. Then, chapter 2 and verse 4 through chapter 2 and verse 12 is a section where Paul, part of this living holy is living in harmony. And he talks about this in a couple of ways. First, he starts, the beginning of this is living in harmony with God. The way that we are obedient to God. Harmony with God is not just obedience to God, but it is understanding how we are active and very important parts of God's plan. And that's the description that he gives in verses 4 and 5. It says, in coming to him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. It's talking about Jesus. And then verse 5, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for the holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so Peter is saying, here's what Jesus did. He was that living stone that was rejected by men, but so are you. You are also living stones. And God is using you to build a house, the description that he gives, a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. You are an integral part of God's plan. What God is using you for is extremely important. And so understanding our part with God, that God is not just using us, but we are working together with him. What we see description, the Apostle Paul uses a lot of times, that we are his workmanship, or we are have a partnership with God. And so our harmony with God is very important. But he also includes in this context here our harmony with the world. How are we viewed? How do we come across to the people who are outside of the body of Christ? Now, again, put yourself in the shoes of Christians in the first century. And they knew that revealing their faith could be the end of their life. And in verse 12 here, we see Peter, he tells them, keep your behavior excellent amongst the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. These Christians, as they were being persecuted by these Romans, there are stories that are told of Roman soldiers that were converted because as they were persecuting and beating these Christians continued to serve them. You can look through a lot of the historical writings of ancient church fathers and see different occurrences of things like that. We have a great example even recorded in Scripture of Paul himself. When Paul was in prison in Rome, it tells us in Acts 28, the influence, what was he doing? It said he taught the entire Praetorian Guard the gospel of Christ. Here's a prisoner, you know how they treated prisoners. And here Paul was teaching the gospel to all of those that were around him. And so that's an example that can be used to show what the Apostle Peter is telling Christians that they need to be doing with those, even those that are their enemies. No matter what they do, they're going to say things to slander you. It doesn't matter. You have got to make sure that your good deeds are seen. They may still kill you, but it will be undeniable that your example is going to stand out to them. They're going to realize that something's not right here. Why are we persecuting people that are doing so many good things? It just doesn't make any sense. And so that's part of what we're going to see in the lesson this morning during worship, of being the salt of the earth and what's involved with that. Then we're not going to go through all of this. Our assignment was just looking at chapter 2. So at the very beginning of chapter 2, we already saw that this harmony with living with harmony is all a part of the beginning of chapter 2. But now we see the issue of submission, as Christians submitting. And Peter, he goes into a lot of giving examples of this. In verses 13 through 17, it's all of those who are in authority over you, every human institution, whether a king as the one in authority or governors as sent by him. Verse 15, for such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Again, you, by the way you're living your life and the example that you're putting out there, that is doing the will of God. that is what is pleasing to God, is to see that no matter what I'm faced with, I will do what's right. And it will have an influence. It will silence the ignorance of foolish men. We see that with the Apostle Paul when he's standing before judges all the time. He would stand before someone, there would be accusations that would be thrown at him, and Paul would just simply say, show me. When did I do that? Where did that happen? And they had no answer because they were foolish men. And so we have the ability to be able to live that kind of a life. There is a peace and there is a comfort, even in the midst of some of the worst suffering and persecution, to know that I know I didn't do anything. I know I am right with God. And so we can rest on that. Then he also adds our submission to masters, and he spends quite a bit of time here in verses 18 through 25 talking about them. And really his message is stop living with a victim mentality. Again, how applicable does this apply to our world today? People, it's always a victim. That's how they raise issues in our society, is they got to find the victims, and then they can raise all kinds of issues from that. And Peter's telling Christians, don't allow yourself to be seen as the victim. And you need to live with a victor's mentality. Look at verse 20 of chapter 2. It says, for what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? If when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. So if you are innocent, I mean, if you sin and are harshly treated, then that's one thing. But if you're doing good and you are suffering, then you need to stand tall because you know that you are in favor with God. You are going to be victorious. Even if it means your life ends, you just won the battle. And so that's Paul. Stop acting like a victim, because we are the victors. We are the winners in all of this. Now, I wanted to go back. I'm not going to have time to look at it a lot. I want to go back to the word that Paul uses in chapter 1 and verse 1, because I think this goes with the theme of the whole letter. And that is, some translations have the word alien. Some use the word exile, sojourners, and pilgrims. The word that's used in the original language is a word, it comes from two different Greek words put together. Para, which means being alongside of something, and demos, which is talking about a group of people, but people of the world. Usually it's used in the context of people that come from a heathen society. And so while we are living alongside people of worldliness and immorality, and that's what he uses there, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout that area of the world. That's what he's talking about. Thayer's Greek lexicon, he says this word is defined like this: one who comes from a foreign country into a strange land to reside by the side of the natives. He also says, in reference to sojourning on earth, with heaven being our native country. Of course, that's what we see the Apostle Paul talking about in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. Philippians 3:20, Paul says, but our citizenship is in heaven. And from it we await the Savior, Jesus Christ. And so Paul uses a word here that is trying to plant this image in the minds of Christians to get them to see that you are not home. You're in a strange land. And while you're in a strange land, don't be surprised if you are mistreated, because this is not home. This is not your homeland. In your homeland, which is heaven, you are going to be treated well. But you're not home right now. We're waiting for that time to come. And so all just in this one word that Paul uses in the very first verse, he plants an image into the minds of the readers of this letter to help them understand their situation, where they are in the way that God sees them. This carries with it a lot of history of persecution, this word. You can go back to John 7, even the persecution of the Jews. As the Jews were scattered at one time, that would have been between the Testaments, the 400 years between the Old and New Testament when all that happened. But we're primarily talking about the scattering of Christians. As they went into the world, this idea of, as he says, those aliens who are scattered. The diaspora is the word that's used here. They're dispersed. They've been scattered because of those that oppose the Christian faith, those that oppose what they believe. And because of that, it happened right after Stephen was stoned. And there was this scattering of Christians everywhere because they were afraid. But even that fear that caused the scattering is something that God used to grow the church, because now people are not just in Jerusalem anymore. Now Christians are spreading out all over that part of the world. And so pilgrims of the dispersion, that's what some translations use here. Those who reside as aliens who are scattered. Some translations say that call pilgrims of the dispersion. We're talking about those who are enduring the struggles of this world while knowing that this world is not their true home. This world, we sing that song, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. And that's the whole thing that Peter is trying to get across here. It changes our perspective. It changes our perspective on life. Life is temporary. It's not permanent. And it also changes our perspective on death. Death is a victory, not a loss. And so this whole thing that Peter is trying to build in their minds is going to hopefully change their perspective of who they are and why they do what they do, and why what's happening to them is happening, and give them encouragement. So that's the first couple of chapters. We'll pick up there, I believe, chapter 3 through, I think the rest of the book is what we'll be looking at on Wednesday night.